Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let's continue implementing the reusable components under our CoreUI module. Let's start by the progress button. I would like to start from the code behind to define the needed dependencies and properties for this progress button. Let's define the automation ID, for example, for testing purposes. And let's add the main container or the main content of the progress button. Let's call it slot. And the command that's going to be used whenever we click on this button, what kind of action we would like to trigger. And in this particular dependency property, we need to handle the changes of this particular command by adding this callback handler. Let's implement this method. Another dependency property that we have to add here is the command parameter and the state of is loading. And I'm going to come back here to add another state next to the command parameter, which is the state of is command running, which is very important in order to disable basically the button once the command in progress. Now let's focus on this particular section. First of all, we have to make sure that we are under the dependency objects of type progress button. Let's call it button. If it's not, we're going to do here return. Now we have to detach the old handler. In this case, instead of doing on command change, we have to create another function. Let's call it on command property changed. Now what we have to do under the on command property changed, we have to change the state of is command running. If the property name is of type async relay command and the sender is an async relay command type parameter. In this case, we have to use the dispatcher and invoke, and we have to set the dependency property is command running equal. This is basically the dependency property of our progress button. All right, async command, and we have to assign from the async command is running like this. And this one shouldn't be static in order to allow access to is running and dispatcher. And here we have to do just button to access the function. That's all for the code behind of this progress button. Now let's go ahead and define the visual of this component button. Let's attach the needed parameters from the dependency properties. We need to attach the automation ID just to hoist this particular properties, automation ID command and command parameter. Now we have to disable the button whenever is loading is true. Inside, we're going to do button and we have to override its style. The is enable. It depends on two states, is command running and is loading. Therefore, we have to create a multi-binding converter. It's going to sound weird, but I couldn't come up actually with a better name. Not or Boolean multi-converter. It's gonna take multiple parameters, endless parameters. Therefore, I'm gonna loop over the values and I'm gonna check if the value is Boolean and B for Boolean and B. In this case, it should be disabled. Therefore, we have to return false. Otherwise, it should be enabled. We have first of all to register the converter. Inside, we have to use the multi-binding converter. For the first input, it's going to be the dependency property is command running. And we have another input is loading. It's going to be disabled if one of those is running. Now we have to define the presentation of this progress button by doing stack panel. And the orientation should be horizontal to place the progress indicator as well as the contents of the button in a horizontal sequence. Let's add the progress indicator with a small margin to the right, and it should be indeterminate. Now we have to control the visibility of this progress indicator. It should be visible is command running or is loading is running. Therefore, we have to create another converter. Let's call it or Boolean multi-converter. It's going to accept multiple parameters. Therefore, I'm going to loop over the values. Now it should be visible when the value is Boolean. In this case, it has to return visibility and visible. Otherwise, it should be collapsed. Now we have to register this under the progress button. And here we have to do, or we have to target the progress bar and visibility. Instead of this converter, we have to use or Boolean to visibility multi-converter. We have to put the content, whatever content you want to do here, and that's all for the progress button. Now let's use this progress button in a preview. let's replace basically what we have done under the form. If you do remember, we have done a preview for the dialog. Let's go under the form. And instead of using here a normal button, let's use the progress button. I'm going to add here a margin, and we have to assign the command, login command. I'm going to delete this. I think it's called login async command. All right, let's use this. I'm going to copy the whole thing actually, and let's get rid of this particular button. And here we have to set the colon to 1. You can see here the progress indicator already. Now we have to add the content of this button under slot. Let's place here just a text, and for the text should be login. To make sure, come back to the CoreUI view model. All right, so let's run the preview. Let's open the dialog. Let's click on login. Nothing happened. We don't have any binding issue. All right, let's come back to the CoreUI preview. Instead of void, it should be task. And for the value of is running or is loading, let's create another state here under the CoreUI. Let's call it is loading. I'm gonna set here is loading to true and here false. To do here binding and data context. Let's remove the async. 100%. It has to do with the command name, because the community toolkit is a little bit picky when it comes to commands naming. Let's come back to the form, and instead of using async here, it has to be login command. Let's run the preview, and it should work. Here we go. It's disabled. What I would like to do here, let's just remove this is loading state. So by defining is loading or not defining is loading, it's not mandatory in this case. And that's pretty much it for this particular component. Let's define the other components for pagination. Now I would like to start from the code behind. We need actually the page count. It has to be 1 by default, and we need the state of the current page and the last visible page index. For example, if you want to show from 1 to 5, then do, for example, the 3 dots and followed by the last page, and we're going to do here 2 by default. Let's try to make it as reusable as possible by defining the command that should be triggered whenever we click on the next page, and the height and the width of the button of the pagination. We need to define the background for the selected item and the foreground of the selected item. And of course, we have to set the brush or the background for the idle item and its foreground. I think that's pretty much it. We have to handle the buttons that should be disabled under the pagination. A lot of things. So first of all, let's start with the component is ready. We need to see if we are on dark theme, on light theme to apply the theme of this particular pagination. And we have to fill basically the data. If let's say, for example, under user has defined pagination counts is 100, we have to fill the data from basically from 1 to 100 to make it visible in the components. We're going to override the needed presentation from the code behind. We will represent everything using a panel. It has to be centered vertically and horizontally, and the orientation should be horizontal. We're going to put here the previous button. Let's give it a name, previous button. Whenever we click on this previous button, we have to change basically the page, and the content should be like this. I'm not going to use any icons. And in between, we have to put the content of pagination, which is going to be the headache of this component. Empty items control, next button. All right, now let's focus on this particular section, items control. Let's say pagination. Or you can just do pagination content, whatever you want to do here. And we have to set virtualization mode to recycling for performance. Next, the wrapper, it should be a stack panel, orientation horizontal, and the presentation of each item should be a button. We have to set for the max width of this particular button, the pagination button width from the dependency property, as well as the max height. A margin to space between elements. On click, whenever we click on this particular item, we have to set it as the current item. For the font weight, it should be basically bold, floating action mini button. Now, which is very important here is the enable value or enable state. It's going to be enabled when the string is not equal, or the content of this data under the items control is not equal to this particular symbol or this particular string. You have to create for it a converter, and I'm going to leave it empty for now. And here I have to assign the border brush to transparent. This is very important for theming. Now for the background. The background is a little bit tricky. We have to make it dynamic by using multiple states, current data and the current page, and whether it is idle or not. Therefore, we have to create for it a converter. I'm going to just prepare this in advance. And background. Now for the content of this particular button, a text block. Again, for the max width, to make it more consistent, we have to assign the max width from the dependency property, and it has to be centered horizontally and vertically. And for the foreground of this particular text should be dynamic again. And it depends on multiple states, the pagination button foreground and the current page, and whether this item is idle or not. Therefore, I'm going to prepare it in advance. Let's call text block foreground. Gonna leave it empty. Now for the text, it should be the current element, and text string is set to character ellipses. Now let's create those needed converters yet to be implemented. Let's create the other one. All right, for the first one, it should be an I value converter. We need to check, first of all, if you are dealing with the string value and the parameter of this particular converter. Let's call it target. Now we have to check if they are different. The pagination should be enabled. Basically, under the pagination button, the button should be enabled. Otherwise, unset. Now let's implement the other one for the background. First of all, we have to check the amount of parameter of this particular converter. It should be 4 parameter maximum, transparent. Let's set the needed parameters for page string, the current page object, selected brush, and the idle brush from the parameters. Now we have just to make sure that this string is not empty, otherwise it's going to return an idle brush. Now we have to disable highlighting on ellipsis page. If we have the page that has, for example, this particular content, we have to disable this particular section by assigning the idle brush. Or in case the developers set it to something like this, in this case, we're going to return idle brush. Now, if the current page is not an integer, we have to return an idle brush. Now we will try to parse basically the string. Try parse. Let's call it page number. If we are able to do so, we're going to return if the page number equal current page from the parameter. In this case, we're going to return selected brush. Otherwise, it should be idle brush. At the end, if nothing happened, we have to return idle brush. Now for the last converter, which is for the foreground, almost with the same manner. However, we need to cache the selected brush and the cached idle brush by defining here some properties for the selected brush and the idle brush. This should be brush. Let's call it cached selected brush. With the same manner, let's add the idle brush. And that's all for the implementation of this particular converter. Let's come back to the pagination and let's use this. Let's register first of all the converters. It's going to be enabled using the binding point string not equal converter, and we have to specify here the parameter like this. If you are interested in the other one, just do here, but it's not going to look good under the view or under the presentation. Therefore, you better space those points with a space. All right. Now for the background, we need to use multi-binding converter. All right, let's get rid of the errors. Let's add the converter here. For the first parameter, the current path, current page, the third parameter, the selected background brush, and the idle background brush for the last argument. With the same manner, we have to define the foreground according to the current data and current page, and we have to set the selected foreground brush and the idle brush. Let's name this to part pagination. Now let's come back to the code behind First things first, we have to fill dynamically the data. I'm going to create it as a private function. Let's create a private observable collection to hold the data. It's going to be of type string. Let's clear the data first. If there is some remaining items under the data, we have to clear it first. Next, we have to set the window size. Basically, how many pages to show in the sliding window. I'm going to proceed with sliding window technique, excluding first and last elements. It's going to be basically the latest visible page. Initialize, or let's create another variable for the maximum page. It's going to be pagination count. If the maximum of the page or page count is less than 2, we have to add 1 to the list and make an early return. We're going to add 1. Basically, it's going to force to show always the number 1 in the list of the pagination. And let's initialize two variables, start and end. Now we have to show the full window at start, no leading ellipses. If the current page is less than the window size, the start, obviously it's going to be 2. And for the end, it could be calculated by using math and minimum of the window size plus 1 and the last page pagination count minus 1. Otherwise, I'm going to show the trailing window near the end with the leading ellipses under the pagination. For example, we can show like a 1, 2, 3, and if the last page is 100, we have to show next to it this number, all right? And before, we have to show this kind of symbol that we have done earlier. This is basically the idea. Now we have to check if the current page is greater or equal than maximum page minus window size. In this case, the start index or the start page, the maximum of those two values, maximum page minus window size and 2, all right? And the end is the maximum page minus 1. And we're going to show the leading ellipses before this window. Now else, the sliding window should be centered around the current page. We're not going to include the leading ellipses. I'm going to copy this. For the start, it's going to be the current page minus the window size divided by 2, because we want to make it centered around the current page, all right? And here for the end, it should be the current page plus the window size divided by 2. Now we have to exclude the first and last element by clamping the window inside the valid page range. If the start page is less than 2, in this case, to add to the previous end page 2 minus start. And the start page should be right now 2. If the end is greater than max page minus 1, we have to take from the start page the end and the maximum page minus 1. And the end page is going to be page count minus 1. Now we can fill the data starting from the index start and I less than the last page, e++, let's do here string interpolation, $, and I. Next we have to show the trailing ellipses only if the window does not reach the last page, minus 1. And we have to show always the last page, max page. I think it's going to handle all cases, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to see that in the preview. Now let's come back to the pagination constructor. Whenever we load the data, let's create the method. What we have to do here under onloaded, first of all, we have to apply the brushes, basically the background and foreground and idle brush, all right? I'm going to call it apply brushes. It has to be set dynamically and we have to fill the data. And we have to set for the part pagination, which is from the design, because we haven't set the item source yet to the items control data. Next, we have to update the button state to set the next button is enabled from the computation. Let's call it update button states. Let's create the needed methods. Do the apply brushes first. For example, selected background brush and try to find the resource. I don't know if we have done it under the UI helper. Okay, we can actually override this. Let's make it nullable. And here we have to do default brush. All right, let's use this function, get brush from theme. This is the background. It has to be primary lighter. And for the default, let's do, for example, brushes and green. You can add here basically named parameters, if you will, to make it more readable. Now with the same manner, let's define the other ones for the idle and selected foreground brush and the idle foreground brush. Next, you have to update the button states. Let's add some computer properties here under private computer properties. When is enabled, the next button should be enabled. When the current page is less than the pagination count, and the previous page should be enabled when the current page is greater than 1. Now the next button from the design or the button from the XAML file is enabled according to the computer property is next enabled. And for the previous button should be is enabled from the computer property is previous enabled. This is not actually on button click, it should be under update button state. Now we have to create the other to implement these buttons whenever we click on next and previous. I'm gonna name this one on next click, and let's create the other one on previous click. First of all, we have to check if the current page is less than the pagination count to execute the command, and we have to pass as an argument current page. Next, we have to update the data by filling again the data, and we have to set the pagination or the items control source to data to refresh the data. With the same manner on previous click, we're going to check if current page is greater than 1. In this case, we're going to decrement the current page, and if it can be executed, we're going to execute the command, and we have to fill the data and to refresh basically the data, which is optional. Let's do it regardless. Now let's try to build the project and see if we have any errors here under the pagination XAML file. We should have to implement this on click. Let's come back to the pagination. Let's rename this particular function on page click. All right, so I'm gonna copy this. All right, let's build the project. The errors are gone. Now, whenever we click on a page, we have to check first of all if the sender is a button and the button data context is a string. Let's pass the string to integer. If we can execute the command and the command is not null, we can set basically the current page to page and to execute the command. All right, so hopefully we did not forget anything. The last thing that we have to do here is to observe the changes of the pagination count and the current page. Therefore, I'm gonna add here a callback handler on pagination count change and another one for the current page. Let's create those methods. On pagination count change, what we have to do here, we're gonna fill basically the data whenever this pagination count changes. If a dependency property is pagination, the new count, you have to cast it to integer, new value. If the new count is less than 1, we have to throw basically an error. Let's say, for example, arguments exception, something like this. And we have to fill basically the data. On current page changed with the same manner, we're gonna fill the data. And it's optional actually to set the pagination item source to refresh the data. And we have to update the state. I think that's pretty much it for this pagination components. It is a little bit complicated because you have to handle all the necessary states. And I don't know if I have done a good job or not, but let's see under the preview. All right, as I said in the beginning of this component, we have to handle the theme because we need to handle the background and the foreground dynamically from the theme, which is now after loading and setting the brush, fill the data, and update button state, we have to handle the theme changes. Therefore, we have to observe the changes of the theme from the theme switcher. Let's create this method. We need to use basically the dispatcher to apply the brushes. That's it. All we have to do is to apply the brushes once again under the new brushes values. However, we have to use the dispatcher and we have to invoke the method apply brushes. I think that's pretty much it. Let's go to the preview and define the preview to see if we have implemented this correctly. Under the preview, create a new window, pagination preview. I would like to add in the CoreUI view model, another state for the current page. And I'm gonna add another command. Let's call it on next page. I'm gonna do current page ++, and that's all. Now let's come back to the preview Let's do CoreUI and pagination. Now let's set the horizontal alignment to center, vertical alignment to center for the command, next page command, for the current page, for the last visible page or the last visible page index, let's say for example 5, for the pagination button height, let's do for example 35, for the width also, and for the pagination count, let's do 100. Now let's go back to the code behind of this particular preview and add the data context. Let's add the preview, open pagination, preview, and show. Let's add the button, pagination preview. Let's run the preview. Pagination preview. It's gonna be disabled and it's gonna be enabled. All right, let's click, for example, on 2. You switch to 2. Let's click on next. Now, if we click, for example, on 6, all right, it's going to give us the available ones, 7 and 9, which is good. Now let's click on 100. It's gonna show the first element always, and it's gonna show 100, and it's the opposite. This one is not gonna be clickable. And you can click previews actually for the others. I think the implementation is not bad. We're gonna leave it at this, and that's going to wrap up our today's video. For the next video, hopefully going to finish implementing the CoreUI, because it's getting a little bit hectic at this point. And for one reason, actually, the lack of some reusable components under the WPF material design. Anyway, I hope you have learned something new. See you in the next one, and happy coding.